Welcome, everybody, to AE911Truth Webinars. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, founder of Architects and Engineers for 911Truth. I am joined by Andy Steele, our wonderful operations coordinator. Andy, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great, Richard, and I want to thank everybody for coming on and watching this webinar. I want to remind everybody, as I always do, that YouTube defaults to a low resolution. So if you want to put your picture into a higher resolution, you just simply click the gearbox underneath the screen. Click 720 HD resolution. That'll make the pictures come through more clearly. Also, we will be taking questions during this presentation, as we always do, on the information that is presented in this particular webinar. If you have questions about other aspects of the evidence we're presenting and later shows, please come back to those webinars and submit those. So with that said, Richard, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, Andy. And I can't tell you, everybody, how delighted I am to report that we've just completed our 4th tour of the United States of America, this time in the Southeast, where we had 12 cities, including 7 in Florida, who saw the screening of firefighters, architects, engineers expose 9/11 myths. I was there personally to introduce the film with Eric Lawyer, firefighter, who started firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. He has 200 firefighters calling for a new investigation. And we were virtually on tour with Eric Lawyer, and I'm telling you, people were really, really waking up to the information presented in that wonderful, richly packed 1.5-hour film that we made a few years ago. We captured Eric Lawyer and myself jointly presenting. And finally, we have that edited, and we've now gone through everywhere but the Midwest. We're going to come back and hit the Midwest in a dozen cities in spring. But because of the initial stop that we made at the annual convention of the American Institute of Architects, where we achieved 3 times more votes on the floor of this annual business meeting of 400 of the top architects in the country, we achieved 3 times more votes for a resolution calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation of Building 7. We are geometrically progressing, everybody. So this is very exciting. So our strategy this year, in preparation for next year's business meeting at the annual convention, which will be in Orlando, is to achieve 1,000 co-sponsors, not 100 like we had this year, but 1,000. And to that end, we're going to be going to all across the country to the American Institute of Architects state and regional conventions. We're very excited about that. We need your support. We'll tell you more about that in a few moments. But we've got to get going today on week 2, where we look more in depth into World Trade Center Building 7. Last week, we had you look at the World Trade Center 7 introduction. This week, we're going to go into more depth, looking at the NIST reports, FEMA, American Society of Civil Engineers, the computer simulation, which they used to prove the initiation of collapse scenario by office fires, an analysis of those fires, and we'll be looking at structural engineers as well. I'm very excited. First, just so you know a little bit about me, I've worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area as a project architect, doing the construction administration for them, and for the whole high school here, a brand new high school, $125 million high school. But more recently in Nevada, this 6-block long retail and mid-rise and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing in this project. But I've been devoting my time to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth exclusively for the last 4 or 5 years, because we have got to get this information out. What information are we talking about? We're talking about the information that has alarmed more than 2,500 architects and engineers. Now, since Philadelphia, we have about 2,700 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation, because we signed up 150 more architects at the convention. We had 8 volunteers. They were always, almost always, talking to each of them, to architects. We were the most popular booth there. It was really quite a scene, and you can see this on our website, the results of that massive effort. And this is the website. You can see resources in the store. You can see evidence, frequently asked questions, the videos of Building 7 coming down that we're going to be looking at today, as we look with a new set of eyes, the scientific method, objective eyes. We've had this method for 100 years in the West. We have a question. How do the towers come down? Well, we formulate the question and do some research. How have other towers come down? We make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. It's our best guess. I think that towers came down by office fires or jet fuel, or maybe the plane impacts, maybe explosions, controlled demolition. We test all the rational hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we do. We'll be evaluating how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. Well, we're going to see how they did with the scientific method. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the evidence. So let's take a look and apply the scientific method as we gather some data. What are the forces that destroyed buildings? Well, we looked at many of these last week. A quick review of fire, which has certainly destroyed buildings, but never a high-rise building in the history of much hotter, longer lasting fires than we see in the Twin Towers or in Building 7, today's 3rd skyscraper that we're looking at. It's an organic process. It burns out an area in about 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So say in a wood frame building, which has, of course, come down due to fire, you'd have large asymmetrical collapses in stages, and the building would fall over, most likely not down through this thousands of tons of structure. In the case of a steel building, it's never happened before, as we'll see. So the building would fall over. But let's look and see what steel buildings might do in a fire.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
in over 20 years, I have not seen until recently a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here, Jonathan Barnett, to the 3 skyscraper collapses on 9/11. And we're going to take a look at the third one, of course, today. So this is very important. The third one, most architects and engineers know nothing about it. I didn't before I became aware of it through listening to a radio interview where I heard David Ray Griffin being interviewed, and an author now of 10 books on the subject of what happened that day. So we're looking at this third tower, which is mysteriously collapsed on the afternoon of 9/11. Most people are unaware that there's a 47-story building that came down at 5:20 in the afternoon. This would be the tallest building in most of our states. It wasn't hit by an airplane. And here it is, 350 feet or so from the North Tower, part of the World Trade Center complex. And it stands even after the towers go down, as you see here, unmolested with the exception of some damage, which NIST says is an inconsequential factor in the building's collapse. So it didn't come down due to vibrations in the ground or damage from steel beams hitting it or diesel fuel fires, which was a common myth put out early on. But NIST has now dispelled those myths and claims that this building came down due to normal building fires. Well, what we're going to do today is just check. We're going to look objectively at the hypothesis of explosive demolition. And last week, we looked at many key features of controlled demolition. We've all seen this, like the old hotels in Las Vegas. We have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure. Well, let's see if that's true in this case, as we listen to Dan Rather narrate for us his first view of this building's collapse.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, that's pretty important information. This is for Dan's intuition that he's using here, which is helpful. We should all be thinking in terms of our existing frame of reference for seeing a building come down in 7 seconds symmetrically. This is what we've all seen, the old hotels in Las Vegas. Problem is that Dan never repeated those words, and we have not seen on mainstream TV, except for maybe 3 or 4 occasions in the last 15 years, the third worst structural failure in modern history is relatively unseen by the public, unknown by the professionals in the building industry. And we think it's very important, so we're bringing it to your attention today. So thank you, Dan Rather. Let's take a look and see if there's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, the second feature of a controlled demolition. As we look from the west side, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. In fact, look this time at the penthouse. It drops about a half a second prior to the overall building collapse, indicating complete core column damage at once before the overall collapse, completely pulling the rug out from the NIST hypothesis, which claims that the collapse started under the east penthouse and then traveled laterally over a span of about 10 seconds. This is one of the this disproves the NIST theory completely, all by itself. You're watching it with your own eyes. What are you seeing? You're seeing what can only be explained by the complete set of 24 core columns being removed all at once, allowing that top penthouse and screen wall to descend uniformly, symmetrically, suddenly. But I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's look at a controlled demolition on the right and the building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper ever in the history of skyscrapers? And yet NIST focuses solely, exclusively on this unprecedented hypothesis of destruction by fire. Now you know why we have nearly 2,700 building and technical professionals demanding a new investigation, because these fires are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. And these are the fires that are said to have brought this building down in 7 seconds, symmetrically, and as you'll see, at free fall acceleration. NIST says, well, these fires were raging at the time of the building's collapse. Well, here are the fires. You can decide whether they're raging or not 2 hours or so before the building's collapse. But NIST claims that around this area, building column 79 in the east penthouse, that's where the initiation of this collapse was. This is where they say those fires are raging. But an hour before this building came down, on that floor, the 12th and 13th floor, the initiation of collapse according to NIST, those fires are proven by the photograph that you're looking at with your own eyes to have been out. They've gone out, they've moved on to the east side. They are not raging. So let's take a closer look. NIST claims those fires are raging at 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. around column 79, because their theory focuses on the beams, as we'll see, expanding at the time of collapse. More likely, according to the photographs on the 12th floor, that fire has been out and moved on to the east side, as we show here in the AE911Truth simulation. Ours is consistent with the photographs. Okay, so let's look and see what NIST is saying about this collapse or initiation of collapse. 1, these long span steel beams heated up, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column, causing this floor 13 to fall on 12, 12, and 11, and so on, pancaking, leaving column 79 unbraced for 9 floors when it buckles, causing the vertical collapse first, and then over a period of 10 seconds or so, a horizontal traveling collapse across this building, which we've already seen cannot possibly be true according to the videos. Well, even their initiation of collapse is completely full of holes. First of all, these beams could not be expanding. They are protected. There's fireproofing on them, 2 and 3 hour fire protection on these beams and columns. Even if they were not fire protected, they would sag before achieving the necessary length to push this girder off of its seat, because that girder is sitting on a 12-inch long seat, which NIST misrepresents. And in order to get in their computer models these beams to expand, they apply all the heat in 1.5 seconds, forcing shear studs to break between the horizontal concrete slab above and these I-beams below, pushing this girder then off of its seat. Well, this girder had shear studs just like these beams have shear studs tying it to the slab. It could not have been pushed off. That's what the drawings show. So, and it could not have been pushed off enough. Well, NIST says, well, it didn't have to be pushed off all the way off the seat, only enough so that when this flange, the bottom flange of this girder, folded because the web, the vertical member of this girder, went far enough just off the edge that the flange folded. But in order to have that scenario take place, they had to ignore the steel stiffeners in their computer models, which were clearly there from the shop drawings, as you see here. The shop drawings show these stiffeners. So that flange could never have folded because these stiffeners keep it from doing exactly that. So NIST lied about this. They also lied about the existence of these shear studs on this girder. This is a lot of detail, but that's what we're doing in week 2. We're looking at the detail that proves that NIST's theory, for about 10 reasons, could not even have happened. For instance, let's just say that this girder did fall off this column. Well, there's 3 other girders very securely framed into that column, which would keep this floor intact even if this girder failed. So that could not possibly have happened, that floor 13 could even fall on floor 12. And even if there was even if that did happen, there wouldn't be enough weight to cause a pancaking collapse. But even if that did happen, what you'd see in a pancaking collapse involving 9 floors is the massive perimeter deformation of the perimeter structural steel system, massive breaking of granite panels and windows as this internally collapsing section that you see in their computer model right here begins to develop. You even see that in their computer model, the massive breaking. But what do the videos show? None of that. A couple of windows breaking is all. And the computer model is stopped after 2 seconds. Why? I mean, they've spent 7 years creating it. They could show us what happens after 2 seconds, but no, it begins to tip over, showing no resemblance to the actual clean, vertical, symmetrical, free fall descent of this building. So we certainly want an investigation into NIST themselves, not just the collapse of this building, because this computer model and their final report, which came out 7 years later, no wonder most architects and engineers know nothing about this building. Everybody had forgotten about it by the time the report came out. Well, it does fall into its own footprint. Just about the center of the pile is in the center of the building footprint. So how do we bring a massive 47-story skyscraper down symmetrically? I mean, think about this. The precision has to be perfect. All these columns, as you saw when this penthouse went down a half a second earlier, all these columns had to have been given up, removed at once, and then synchronistically timed floor by floor, because this building is falling straight down. And then also synchronistically, the perimeter columns need to be removed. Does fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, have that level of precision? Most reasonable people do not think so. How fast is the building coming down? Well, feature 4 of the controlled demolition set of features shows that they come down pretty fast, often at free fall. In fact, NIST finally admits in their final report that this building did come down at free fall, after denying it for years, but they were confronted publicly by a member of AE911Truth, David Chandler, who said, this is easily measurable. How can you just say that it didn't, that it came down shy of free fall? Well, they finally admit that a third of this building's 7-second fall, it was free fall, but they do not acknowledge the implications of that. That those columns had to have been removed, or how that could have happened. Do we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure? Completely dismembered, like a house of cards. This is a moment-resisting steel frame building. And actually part of it was braced frame as well. But the moment resisting is very, very rigidly welded column to beam connections. So how does it fall in a pile 4 to 6 stories tall? 47 stories altogether. We should see a mangled building at the bottom, something like you see in these natural collapses, where the steel, in this case, these are concrete buildings, but the structural beams and columns are not completely dismembered from each other. We see what's left of a building. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, which we'll get to. Is there minimal damage to adjacent structures? That's one of the purposes, of course, of controlled demolition, and that appears to have been achieved here in this case. And last week we looked at explosions, pyroclastic-like clouds, and pools of molten iron and the evidence of extreme heat. But we've got more evidence for you this week as we look at the FEMA report that came out in 2002, whose author, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile that appeared to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Now, he's saying this because first responders, firefighters, structural engineers have never seen the kind of corrosion that we're seeing here, a melting of steel. This is what he's talking about. Evaporation. This requires 4,000 degree temperatures to evaporate steel. It only begins to melt at 2,800 degrees. Office fires are maybe 500 degrees. Some people claim 1,000 degrees. Even that is like 3 times or 4 times shy of the temperature required to achieve the phenomena that's very adequately documented in the Appendix C of the 2002 FEMA report, the metallurgical examination. A very good, careful examination, which, by the way, NIST completely throws out of their final report when they took over this investigation after this report was released. We don't have Appendix C anymore. We don't have a metallurgical examination. We don't have the details that categorically show the presence of sulfur. Where does the sulfur come from? Well, the sulfur is a hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel. The New York Times calls it the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Well, sulfur doesn't come from gypsum board. It's bonded calcium sulfate in gypsum board, and NIST or another speculator suggests that maybe the sulfur came from the gypsum board. Well, gypsum board is used to protect steel. It's never turned around and attacked it in history, 100-year history of using gypsum in various forms to protect steel structures. Eutectic reactions are what's created with sulfur. Intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this piece from World Trade Center 7. What can do this to steel? Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron. Now, think about that. What is liquid iron? It's molten. We're talking about 2,800 degree temperatures. There's no source for the sulfur, save thermite, which is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. We're going to look in a very detailed way in week 3, next Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, at the evidence of thermite and very high-tech forms of thermite. So far, though, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction or destruction with incendiaries. Fire cannot really create any one of these features, let alone all 10 of them. Well, fires like these, World Trade Center 5, if any of these World Trade Center buildings were going to come down due to fire, wouldn't we expect it to be this one, fully engulfed? Did it collapse? No. Mid-rise, high-rise structures are fireproofed. They do not collapse. Even when they're not fireproofed, they don't collapse, as you saw in the test done in the UK in the previous video we looked at in 1995, where unprotected steel beams merely sag. They do not collapse, fail, and certainly do not melt. Not even in China, 2009, completely engulfed, top to bottom. Did it collapse? Well, fires like these, we'd expect it to come down. Some of us might, if we use our imagination, but never before. You can see on the left before, on the right, slightly toasted around the edges, being remodeled, put back into use. No collapse. But these small fires, scattered and few, brought this building down in about 6 or 7 seconds in a pile centered in the building's footprint for the first time ever. And most architects know nothing about it. It should be the most studied building failure in the history of building failures. What about FEMA and NIST reports? Well, there was investigations, and we started in 2001 with the American Society of Civil Engineers. They were volunteers, but these are volunteers that worked their way through every one of these investigations. They're really building reports into the FEMA report, which finally had some funding, $600,000, and then into the NIST report, which, as we said, came out 7 years later. So the individuals responsible for these reports were put in place very, very carefully, and and are associated with large civil engineering firms that have hundreds of thousands of dollars of contract work with the federal government. So they're not independent. As you can see here, Thornton Tomasetti worked his way all the way through the NIST report, Gene Corley, some common names, and even helped with the effort by popular mechanics to try to disprove and quiet some of the questions raised by so many professionals in the industry. Well, what does FEMA say when they came out with their early report and suggesting an internal failure and implosion? Interesting. We have a lot more to say about FEMA and the last week and the destruction, the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene where this material was, as we saw, removed from the scene of the crime within 2 weeks following 9/11, shipped to China for recycling. 99% of the steel before investigators could look at it. But let's look at some of the experts like Hugo Bachmann, professor, chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics in Switzerland. In my opinion, Building 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. We have about 80 or 90 structural engineers signed on to our petition, calling upon Congress for a new investigation, an independent investigation, one that uses the scientific method relative to the evidence that you've seen in this series of 4 webinars, one that brings forth witnesses, offers them immunity to come forth, takes that testimony under oath, all of which was not done in the earlier investigations. But he says a local failure, Kamal Obeid, in this case, structural engineer from California, in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Can fire do that? Did we have foreknowledge of the destruction of this building? It takes months, of course, to plan, engineer, place explosives. Well, Nick Visconti, who we don't imagine is responsible for placing explosives. Fire departments don't do that. But what does he say? We're moving the command post over this way, because the command post was in or around the outside of Building 7. That building's coming down. So here he's announcing that the building's coming down. And this is, the firefighters were told not to fight the fire. These were a few small and scattered fires, and yet they weren't allowed to fight it because they were told it had structural damage. They're all expecting the building to come down. And they told Indira Singh that Building 7 was going to come down or was being brought down. Interesting. Volition here. They're intending to bring it down. Did they actually use those words? And who was it that was telling you this? She says the fire department. So these are very publicly available testimony here. We're not making this stuff up, nor these police and construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It's coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys.
We are looking back. It's a building about to blow up. Hopefully, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. Who is now claiming the building is going to do fires, blow up buildings? We looked at other foreknowledge last week, including a countdown to this building's collapse. Well, with what we've been able to show in the 40 minutes that we've had so far, we believe that the hypothesis of explosive demolition is corroborated, and we want you to ask yourself this question. Is it or is it not? Is there a need for an investigation? Do we have this week shown the 8 key characteristic features of explosive destruction? Can fire create any one of those, let alone all 8 of them? And together with last week's evidence that we showed all 10 of them. Is there additional information available, corroboration, circumstantial evidence that shows, together with the direct evidence, proof of controlled demolition to you? Well, I hope you'll submit your answer to that question online on our website right now, along with your other questions, because we're going to take those questions in just a minute. But I want to show you that if you're convinced that this building needs a new investigation and that there's evidence here of controlled demolition, then for goodness sake, sign our petition online. Become a member of AE911Truth for $2.50 a month, $5, $10 or more a month. You can join us, stand with us, help us as a body to do the work, such as the AIA conventions that we have to go to this year to achieve 1,000 co-sponsors at the next year's AIA convention. It takes tens of thousands of dollars to achieve, to send us where we need to be in the face of the American Institute of Architects and its 80,000 members. Donate online now, if you can, and secure our effort to wake up the profession and the public at large. And volunteer with AE911Truth. We need you. There's many things you can do. Andy, you've got some ideas for volunteering. What have you done?
Sure we do. I've got a big board here full of tasks that we are currently undertaking. Lots of hardworking volunteers taking up the call. So if you are moved by this evidence, if you want to do something about it, then just go to this webpage, AE911Truth.org. At the very top, it says what you can do. You click that, and then you fill out the volunteer form that comes up, and we will be in touch with you, and we'll get you on a task that is needed for this important information to get out.
Wonderful. And just join us. We have dozens and dozens of people over the course of months that really come to help us out, help Andy out. We need to demand a new investigation. There's things you can do right from your own computer. Send the AE911Truth.org link to all of your colleagues, your friends, elected representatives, the media, television, radio, newspaper. Write letters to the editor. Tell everyone you know this is not a secret. This is not something that you can keep secret, because, I mean, just think about this. If Building 7, if we were not told the truth about Building 7, a massive building that went down on the day of 9/11, were we told the truth about the World Trade Center Twin Towers? Well, we're going to get to that evidence next week and the following week with weeks 3 and 4. And by the time you come back and look at those webinars and our DVDs, which I'm going to screen for you real quick, you're going to be convinced that we were not told the truth, and therefore that we need a new investigation, not just because we were lied to about buildings. If we were lied to about buildings, we were lied to about the 9/11 Truth event itself and everything that followed from it. We've lost 7,000 soldiers and many, many other soldiers. There's been 1 million to 2 million people killed in the Middle East. We've lost valuable civil liberties that we've traded for security, and now we have neither. So there are implications that are vast and deep in our society today in the aftermath of 9/11, even 15 years later. This is a current topic. This is not history we're talking about here. We're talking about finding out what's going on at very deep levels. So it's very important that we share the work with others, the evidence. And that evidence is being analyzed as we speak in a 2-year, $275,000 effort by the University of Alaska. One of the top forensic structural engineers in the country is doing a computerized dynamic analysis. We need your support with this project too. Please go to WTC7evaluation.org to find out how you can help. And we need objective feedback from professionals, and we need support. Also, beyond misinformation, you can get this 55-page booklet free. Just click on the link down below. And you'll be on our mailing list as well. We'll give you the latest evidence we're putting together and the latest efforts and success we're having toward getting a real investigation. And you get a free 55-page PDF that you can pass on to other professionals and non-professionals alike. It's an incredible look where we pull the rug out from the main tenets of NIST's misinformation. We do that also in our 90-minute documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. And I want to show you the 2-minute trailer of this landmark DVD, which highlights 40 high-rise structural and high-rise architects and structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, and many others, all laying out the evidence for the explosive demolition of this building. Take a look.
I could go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can get the 1-hour version of that film on YouTube and watch it for free. The 90-minute version is available on our store, and I encourage you to show it to everybody, screen it. It's extraordinary. We've been to the Northwest with our other film, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers. We've been to the Northeast, we've been to the Southeast, and we've been to the Southwest. We've shown it 70 times across this country, and we encourage you to show it to others. Eric Lawyer is absolutely astounding as the founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. This is another film that has to be shown to every firefighter in the country. Today was week 2. We looked at in-depth analysis of the NIST reports, their computer simulation, the fires. Next week, we start to look at the Twin Towers, explosive destruction. Week 4, we look at the extreme heat. Today, right now, we're going to see if we have any questions. Andy?
Yeah, we have a few good questions today. Our first one is very simple. It asks, how has NIST responded to your claims?
Well, NIST is not very responsive to our requests for information. We're suing them currently to release information such as the computer input data to Building 7, which they claim they will not release because it could jeopardize public safety. What? If you can't release the information that the architects and engineers need, those who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, yet we can't get the computer input data that shows how you came to the conclusion that this building, for the first time in history, came down due to office fires? No, we're not buying that. NIST does have a frequently asked questions on their website. And one of several of those say, well, did Building 7 come down due to controlled demolition? And they claim, well, if that were true, you'd heard a bomb big enough to build, that would have to be very loud and heard for miles if it were big enough to take out to build column 79. And of course, completely ignoring in that response the evidence of thermite, which is overwhelming in this building and the Twin Towers. And yet another question they seek to answer about thermite says, well, you'd have to have hundreds of pounds of thermite, and that couldn't have been brought into the building to take out that column. Well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate the evidence for incendiary and explosive destruction, since there's so much evidence for it. The fact that you might have been difficult to get in. Why don't we investigate the security company, Securicom, Stratosec, who had the electronic security for these buildings up until the day of 9/11? Why don't we investigate the largest elevator modernization in the world, which gave ACE Elevator immediate access to the core columns and beams in the Twin Towers? There's a lot of questions here that NIST is not even addressing. And we talked about the free fall acceleration, which they were forced finally to admit, but have no explanation or attempt at explanation for.
Okay, our next question asks, what specifically actually hit Building 7 when the Twin Towers went down? So I guess it's asking what part of the Twin Towers actually hit Building 7 according to the official reports.
Well, early on, NIST was claiming that 25% of Building 7 was scooped out. 25% of the depth, meaning a quarter of the way, all the way through from the side that was facing the Twin Towers. And they later retract this. There's no photos that survive in their final report that shows damage that's significant at all. In fact, they actually say the damage that did occur from these beams and columns that hit Building 7 was an insignificant factor in the building's collapse. Why do they say that? Well, they may have been forced to say that because their whole theory works on damage to the other side of the building, the northeast side of the building, because the east penthouse came down 6 seconds prior to any other part of this building coming down. So they focused their effort on column 79 at floor 12, 13, etc., deep underneath that east penthouse, and developed a whole theory. Now, all of that is in complete contradiction to the myths that remain out there that suggest that there was this significant damage that caused the buildings to come down. Let's just remove that. NIST removed it. We all can remove that from our minds now and focus on what NIST did say, which, by the way, they also removed diesel fuel fires from their final report, which was an early myth that they also fed to popular mechanics, who repeated these myths, which have long since been disproven and withdrawn by NIST.
Okay, our next question is a similar one. It asks, are there photos of the damage that Building 7 sustained when the North Tower came down?
Yes, some of those photos are proven to have been faked, and they don't appear in the final reports. Therefore, in the NIST report, there are some damage that's shown, but it's again insignificant. There's one photograph that shows, and a myth that appears that suggests that a complete vertical channel of destruction down the face of Building 7 was happening, but NIST does not sustain this, support this photograph or myth either.
Okay, our next question asks, is it true that the NIST report says the fires were only 15 minutes to 20 minutes in any one spot?
I think NIST does acknowledge that. Certainly, Jonathan Barnett acknowledges that. I can't tell you where in the NIST report that occurs, but it is common knowledge and an industry set of basic assumptions and understandings that there's not enough fuel in an office fire. That's why we have such strong codes about flammable materials in high-rise office buildings. You can't even put in even desks that are made out of wood have to achieve minimal or restrictive standards for flammability. Same with rugs, etc. So the standard is 20 minutes in a given area. It's all the fuel there is to burn, and yet ironically, NIST shows, in contradiction to that reality, these fires burning for over an hour, 2 hours in that area around column 79, in contradiction to the photos which show it burned out and moved on.
Okay, our last question asks about the importance of the free fall. It says, if World Trade Center 7 was in free fall for 2.5 seconds, what about for the rest of the collapse?
It was in downward acceleration the entire time of the 7-second collapse of this building. The first 2.25 seconds were in actual free fall. And what that means, by the way, is that there could not have been not even one of those 80 columns that gave any resistance, not a shred of resistance to this building's downward descent, meaning they disappeared. How do you disappear a column? Well, that's the purpose of controlled demolition. After the first 2.25 seconds, the remaining 2/3 of this building's 7-second fall is still accelerating, darn near a free fall acceleration. It only slows down a little bit, indicating that some of those columns gave some resistance, but those columns are almost solid steel at the base of this structure. So they certainly did not give enough resistance to slow this building down. And in any kind of a building collapse, we have deceleration. Even in pancaking collapses in lift slab construction, they have deceleration. Even when there's no columns decelerating it, the connections from the slab to the columns provide some resistance, giving some amount of deceleration. And we don't see that in the Building 7. We don't see it in the Twin Towers either. They are accelerating faster and faster, straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the cold, hard, intact structural steel columns that were designed 5 times stronger than they needed to be to hold this building up for its life.
Okay, well, we've run through to the end of our questions for today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you are moved by this evidence, you want other people, particularly building professionals, to see it, we urge you to please forward this link, AE911Truth.org/webinars, to other people. The archive will remain up for the following week until the next one. And of course, we encourage you to come to the next webinar as well.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thanks everybody for joining us. Week 3 is next, where we look into the Twin Towers. We'll see you there.